Hey, hi everyone. I'm Caroline Brown. I'm the Communications and Outreach Associate at the Freshwater Trust. Thank you all so much for coming. We're really excited to share our work in the Rogue with you. So to get it started, here's just a rundown of our event. We're going to talk a little bit about our work in the Rogue Basin. Alex Johnson, the director of our Freshwater Fund, is kind of going to give an overview. Then we'll introduce all of our restoration project managers, who are a team. We'll then discuss problems, solutions, and then the Oregon wildfires. And then we will have a half an hour for question and answer. So as you have questions throughout the event, feel free to ask them. There's a question and answer part of the webinar where you can go up and type them. You can also type them into the chat. So to start it off, Alex, if you want to go ahead.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Johnson. As she said, I am the Freshwater Fund Director here at the Freshwater Trust. We appreciate everyone spending their evening with us instead of watching the presidential debate, although from watching the first one, I can't blame you. And we're excited to show you a little bit about what's going on in the Rogue, and very proud of some of the work that's gone on with both our team and all of our partners. The Freshwater Trust, just so everybody's on the same page, we are a conservation nonprofit focused on protecting and restoring river ecosystems in the American West. We really focus on both cutting edge analytics, analyses that help drive our work, prioritize our work, and understand how much is enough, as well as putting large programs on the ground through Oregon, Idaho, California, Washington, Colorado, and other places. So, but tonight is all about the Rogue River. Hopefully it has some benefit for everybody tuning in, and we're excited to share. So a market for shade. Our predecessor organizations, Oregon Trout and the Oregon Water Trust, both worked in the Rogue River in Southern Oregon in the 90s, but we hadn't done very much more recently until around 2010, when all of a sudden things started heating up, and we'll get into that in a big way. So the Freshwater Trust had been part of a Oregon group of stakeholders looking at protocols for Clean Water Act compliance for regulated entities. One such entity was the Medford wastewater treatment plant. So from talking with those stakeholders 2007 to 2009, that got us introduced to Medford, and we started working with Medford specifically in 2010, 2011. They were facing a new permit focused on the temperature that they were putting into the Rogue River. The alternatives that they were looking at to comply with the Clean Water Act were either a gigantic holding pond to hold water for a couple months starting in October, or a cooling tower. Those were $16 million or more, and the Freshwater Trust, armed with some new models for how much shade a tree can generate on a riverbank, demonstrated that the City of Medford could save a lot of money and really create resiliency by planting trees. So what you see there in the picture is starting to recruit our very first landowner. We contracted with the City of Medford in 2011. And from then on out, we have been hiring staff, managing contractors, and most importantly, building relationships with landowners that have access to the riverbanks to plant trees and do a number of other things that help restore the health of the Rogue River. And so importantly, the City of Medford is not our only partner. We're now, we went from starting to plant trees and quantifying the temperature benefits to working with the Bureau of Reclamation on biological opinion compliance, which is another whole regulatory regime that required the Bureau of Reclamation to plant trees as well as do large wood placement, which some of our project managers will discuss in detail. And all told, we've brought in a number of other partners and funders that are all focused on the same thing, looking to prioritize environmental benefits in the places that they're most needed, and quantify the benefits that we generate. And year after year, we've seen this program grow really rapidly. And obviously, we have our staff on the line here. We have 3 folks in Ashland. We have a number of other colleagues around the west that help out. But most importantly, in terms of the Rogue, is a lot of partnerships drive this work. Three people can't do this all by themselves. We've since the last 8 years, we've collected 44 landowner partners. We have contracted with a number of small businesses, nurseries, planting crews, irrigation, livestock exclusion, a number of different things. And all of the different programs have added up to over $14 million put on the ground. And that's not even quantifying some of the adjacent funding that has been brought in by groups that we work a lot with. Those are just the dollars that have come through our doors and been put on the ground. Beyond the City of Medford, which is in its last year, I think, of planting, and the Bureau of Reclamation, we've since partnered with the City of Ashland, the U.S. Forest Service, the Oregon Department of Transportation, and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, as well as the Pacific Power Blue Sky Fund. So all of those entities and agencies are looking to develop health and resiliency via restoration on the Rogue, and we're more than happy to work that into our ever-growing program. What that looks like on the ground is pretty exciting. Over 13,000 trees planted. And importantly, because we are very outcomes oriented, a tree is not a tree is not a tree. We quantify the temperature benefits, in this case, solar load, of every planting project that we do. And similarly, we quantify nutrient runoff reductions, and we quantify, linear feet of fish habitat, et cetera. And so we're very excited about that. There's a lot more to come, and not only in this session, but we've got plenty of more work contracted in the years ahead to continue to kind of roll this snowball. That was a lot in a short amount of time. If you have any questions, please send them in through the chat, and we can get to them at the end of this discussion. So our team down here is Hillary, Caitlin, and Eugene. They're all restoration project managers, and they do a little bit of everything, as you can imagine, with such a lot of work going on in different places around Ashland, Medford, tributaries, the main stem Rogue, et cetera. We're going to start with Eugene Weir. I met him back in 2011. He was with the Rogue Valley Council of Governments, and we started working with that organization to recruit landowners, and Eugene was a fantastic fit to be our first project manager when we finally saw the need to hire staff to get rolling. So he's been with us really since this thing started ticking up, and he can walk you through not only what the work looks like, but really what it is responding to in terms of the degraded conditions of this river system. So Eugene, I pass it over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And between Caitlin and Hillary and I think we'd like to be able to capture this, and also thank you for joining us and taking interest in the Rogue River and the work that we're doing here. Rivers throughout the West face many of the same problems. Historically, the First Nations people that occupied these drainages, including the Rogue, found them very diverse, resource-rich places, and they developed their own management for these places that largely kept it intact and kept it functioning. When our ancestors arrived here, they saw rich resources as well, including fertile farmland on most of our river's floodplains. And so development began there, clearing to make way for productive farm fields on those acres. And that, over time had an impact on the river. Combination of clearing, development for agriculture, modifications to the hydrology. Once you've cleared a field, you kind of want to protect it. So you change the course of the river, and all that really ended up reducing the thermal buffering capabilities of our riparian areas, which were extant before the time that they began to be removed. And they also, it reduced their ability to absorb nutrients and sediment that come off the landscape. So over time, when you combine that with livestock having access to stream corridors, creating a source of disturbance, some grazing is actually good for the land. Overgrazing can be a source of disturbance. And when you combine that disturbance with the presence and growing number of invasive weeds that are in our watersheds, you begin to start a negative feedback cycle where disturbance happens, weeds capture that ground that's been disturbed. Then the weeds are more susceptible to disturbance next time when the next flood or fire comes, and then they're replaced by more weeds, and it starts this negative cycle. So, land alterations on the floodplain, altered hydrology, and invasive species are really kind of the big problems that we're tackling on the Rogue, as many rivers in the West. And this is an example of kind of how that feedback loop can happen. This is a site in Ashland where we've actually done a really nice restoration project. This site was damaged in the 97 flood. The bank got scoured off by the flood of record, or last big flood we've had. And invasive species took that bank back. Subsequently, the bank continues to erode in high water, replaced by invasives. And we've since taken this and turned it into a nice native plant landscape along this section of Bear Creek, right in this person's yard. So kind of break that cycle. And that's the good news, is that we can break that cycle and return to a more resilient native plant community with simple techniques that we can employ. So, at sites like this, when you see this kind of cycle happening, you're looking at something that's just only going to get more disturbed if we don't touch it and do something about it. Luckily, the Freshwater Trust programs are well designed to treat locations like this, and especially the places where we really need shade, where we need additional shade. And we have great tools for predicting that, things like our Basin Scout and other models that we use that help us understand where shade's going to be the most beneficial, help us key in on these locations. Invasive species treatment is going to be important everywhere in the basin, but there are key locations where shade can have the most impact in terms of moderating water quality and water temperature in our streams. There's been some really encouraging research that came out as part of what got me so excited about working for the Freshwater Trust and implementing this work. Just most recently, Juan Zell in 2019, Journal of American Water Resources. And these researchers found that using advanced models, they were able to look at the John Day and decide that of all the actions that could be performed, riparian vegetation was going to be by far the most effective at maintaining and actually cooling the stream over time. And this is the piece that really got me stoked, is that if implemented, if those riparian projects were implemented, that stream would actually be colder in 30 years than it is today, even under the most aggressive climate change scenarios. So it's just very simple. We need to replace the vegetation that is the thermal buffer on our streams, and also the filtration for the water that's entering our streams. So we've developed some really good techniques and some programs that help us get out there and get at that problem and develop that solution. So really, if we need stewardship is a big piece of this. And you can't really do stewardship. It's one thing to go plant a tree, but you can't really follow through and get the benefits of that tree, even if you put it in the right place. If you don't have the ability to come back and continue to steward that site for a number of years. And we're typically finding that it's year 3, 4, and 5 where these restoration projects really start to establish and become self-sustaining. And up to that point, they do need quite a bit of stewardship, mostly invasive species management type stuff. But the Freshwater Trust, great programs like the Water Quality Trading Program, they're 20-year programs, 20-year projects. So they have that long-term stewardship investment, and we're really seeing that even just consistent stewardship in the first 5 years equates to a much higher success rate and a much more resilient and a riparian community that looks like the way you would expect a native plant community to look. So water quality trading has been a great anchor program to help leverage other types of funding sources and get a lot of that work happening. We have dozens of those projects out there. They're large projects on scale, many of them half-mile or more in size in terms of stream bank restored. Another part of the solution is in-stream wood, and Hillary's gonna talk a little bit about this, but we like to build in-stream habitat, and we do it for a couple reasons. One, it creates instant fish habitat, and you build good habitat and they move into it quickly. And that's been our observation. But these projects also help to reactivate floodplains. And those activated floodplains are where riparian vegetation thrives. So they're also where filtration takes place, where water storage takes place. So activating the floodplain is really an important part of our habitat work in stream, as well as just creating instant good fish habitat. But like I mentioned before, really a lot of it hinges on stewardship. So management of invasive species is a big piece of it, and that's going to touch into what we're talking about tonight in terms of resiliency. You know, we've known that managing blackberry is important and other weeds is important to establishing a native plant community and one that will be able to hold the ground and resist invasion of weeds in the future. What we didn't really realize until a few years into it is that there's a public safety component to that, particularly when you're working in urban streams like Bear Creek. And at that, you know, we were looking at that as mostly what's patrollable, what's safe for recreating near, how do we make these sites safe and manage transient camping and things like that in them. So invasive species management has a lot to do with that. And we've actually set about building projects that are not only resilient from the perspective of the environment, but also are safe for the public. And we're finding that those same practices actually equate to resilience against fire on these projects too. So that's been a really encouraging piece of the work. We're learning that it's not just an environmental benefit, it's a community benefit. And really, you know, we work with a lot of private landowners. That's one of our strengths. And we really have covered a lot of ground that is really hard to get to. The private lands are generally the hardest places to do restorative work because it relies on so many relationships. So I've covered a lot. I'm going to pass off to Caitlin here and let her talk a little bit about some of our project work.
All right, thanks Eugene. My name's Caitlin and I also work in the road, and I'm going to showcase some of the project work that we've been doing in the Little Butte Basin. For those of you that don't know the area, Little Butte's a tributary to the Rogue River, and the confluence can be found at Tuville Park right in Central Point. Little Butte's known to be one of the best fish producing streams in the area. They have steelhead, coho, Chinook, salmon, all spawning there. And like many tributaries in the Rogue, it is having some problems with development and especially agriculture. So we have narrowing riparian buffers, and we have some water quality issues around cows getting into the stream, eroding banks and things like that. So some things that we do are revegetating the banks of the river. Sometimes we also use in-stream structures, which is something that Hillary's going to highlight. And right now you're seeing a slideshow of some of the changes across time in revegetation. We often start with head-high blackberry or some sort of invasive species like poison hemlock or star thistle. I'm seeing teasel on there. And we go ahead in and we clear these areas to prepare them. And then we'll replant with native trees and shrubs that are found in the area. So over time, we watch these areas. We take care to have long-term stewardship, like Eugene had mentioned. And over about 5 years, we get the sites to establish with irrigation and browse, control with caging to protect against beaver and deer. And we will nurture the sites along until we think they get to a point where they're outside of that browse height and chugging along nicely. So this slide right here is going to show you this head-high blackberry that was probably like 6 to 10 feet tall. And you see a lot of non-native pasture grasses and target weeds in there. And then the next slide is going to show the progress against time. So we have pre-project, post-implementation, and then several years afterwards. 1 year later, 2 years later, and the next slide. Oh, here's, yep, and 3 years later, up to 5 years later. So you can really see the change across time. I think I'm going to hand it off to Hillary after that. Oh, TG.
Actually, I'm going to take this one. This is one of my favorite projects. This is the Lone Pine project, and it's in Medford, right in front of the Medford Airport. This is a project we did through the BOR BIOP work, the Bureau of Reclamation's work. They needed to recreate riparian habitat that had been lost due to flow alterations. We chose this stream because although it looks like a ditch to most people, it actually supports steelhead and coho and even Chinook on occasion spawn and rear in here. In the airport, we heard they were doing a wetland mitigation project that was going to open up the floodplain a little bit there and create some wetland habitats. So we did this great complementary project where we reestablished the riparian vegetation on the south bank of the stream where the shade was most important and completely lacking before. And now we've got beavers have moved into this site about 3 years on, started harvesting our vegetation. They built dams and flooded the wetland and the floodplain and have created a really dynamic and really neat habitat with great fish habitat out of what was before basically a ditch running along in front of the airport. So great partner here with the airport. They've been really wonderful to work with. This is a fantastic project, and we've documented fish spawning within this project multiple years since the beginning of it. This project was also one where we sought to model how a project could be community safe. So this project, as it's developed, it's in around year 5 now. The trees are getting tall enough that we can begin to limb them up a little bit underneath and open up some sight lanes through this project so that when security patrols around the airport, they're able to see into this area with some visual to see who's in there. There's also a nature trail or kind of a recreational trail that runs along the side of it used by folks at the airport and BLM office. And they want to be able to see in there so that there's not an ambush situation that could happen. And so typically, you think of these really thick riparian areas as being a safe haven for wildlife and a cool corridor. They can also attract people. So we are working on designing projects that can kind of meet both community safety objectives as well as demonstrate environmental gain. And there have been numerous observations of fish on Neal Creek or on Lone Pine Creek, sorry, since this project went in. Lone Pine Creek's actually cooled down a little bit as a result from this project, and that's really exciting. I can also tell you a little bit about some of our work along the Rogue River. Like I mentioned before, we've done a lot of larger water quality trading projects. Some of these slides are from Rogue 127, which is kind of at the base of Lower Table Rock. And this is an area that was disturbed historically by gravel mining. So kind of a tough place to recover. The channel has been altered, but also the banks. And we were able to come in, beginning with our very first project, 1 mile upstream, that original slide Alex showed where I was talking with the landowner there. We began with that project, and we've since done well over 1 mile along this section of stream in 3 consecutive projects, working with large holding landowners there in that reach. It's an important reach because the river slows down, so tall cottonwood canopy in this area really helps abate solar load that otherwise builds up quickly in that slow moving section of water. So we use our models to find these places where shade is going to be most important. And then we work with the landowners to develop projects that are beneficial to their properties, that make them more resilient, more beautiful, more manageable in the future, as well as getting these environmental gains that we're after, which is cooling, keeping the river cool longer and creating a lot of really neat riparian habitat, which is kind of the auxiliary benefit of shade for compliance. The other side of that is that you have this huge benefit to the environment for, many, many years to come, long beyond the 20-year life of this specific project. I could go on and on about these projects because each one's got an hour's worth of information in them, but I'm gonna hand off to Hillary because there's some good stuff here too.
Thanks so much, Eugene and Caitlin have both talked a lot about some of the restoration actions that we take outside of the river. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the actions that we can actually put inside the creek. We've heard a lot about resiliency and complexity and biological diversity, both equal resiliency, and large wood placement is some of the actions that we can take inside the stream to restore some of that complexity. And it focuses a lot on fish. And the reason that we do that is because not only do salmon and steelhead serve really important cultural, economic, and subsistence, they are a really important member of the ecology. They're also really good indicator species. They are really sensitive to changes in water quality and the reduction of habitat complexity. Each life stage of salmon and steelhead requires different types of habitat. And we've lost a lot of that complexity due to the development that Eugene mentioned. And also in 1964, there was a major flood event that caused the thinking at the time to think that if you removed large wood, if you removed boulders and you disconnected rivers from their floodplain and channelized them and straightened them, that would get water from the mountains to the ocean as quickly as possible, and that would mitigate for flood risk. Unfortunately, that was not the case. And it was not a great solution to flooding, and it was really, really bad for fish. So the slides that are going on your screen there just demonstrate some of the different large wood projects that we've done that both increase the habitat complexity for fish, adding those different limiting factors to fisheries recovery. Sometimes that's cold water refugia, sometimes it's spawning habitat. In our Rogue River watershed and its tributaries, it's actually most often the juvenile fish habitat that is most needed to recover the numbers that we historically would have seen in the Rogue River watershed. And that often includes reconnecting rivers with the floodplain through historic side channel reconnection, building large wood structures that provide deep pools and slower slack waters that juvenile fish can have shelter in and find little nooks and crannies where they're safe from predators and can feed for the 1 or 2 years before they smolt and go to the ocean. We've also seen really incredible numbers in Neal Creek and Bear Creek and Little Butte Creek of the ecological response to this work. I think all of our work that we do is really rewarding stuff, but these types of numbers that you see, the juvenile fish coming back, is just that ecological response that we're looking for, where we're restoring these natural processes. And, you know, rivers want to be rivers and fish know how to be fish. And we just kind of need to get in there and get out of their way most often to start restoring some of the natural processes. And I will try to keep it brief because I know we want to get to the Q&A. So I think, you know, we've talked a lot about resiliency, and we've recently undergone a really traumatic community event with the Alameda fires. And we've seen firsthand how some of our restoration sites fare under a disaster like this. And Eugene is going to talk about our projects and what we've learned with the Alameda fires and what we plan to do next.
Thanks, Hill. So, you know, when the Alameda fire broke out, I was at home in Ashland, and it started right near a restoration project that's partway into development. It's been cleared of its invasives, but it hadn't been planted yet. So I was naturally interested in that, and, you know, that's interesting. I wonder how it's going to play out on that site. But it only took a few minutes for me to realize that our Wagner Creek project, the one that you're seeing in these slides, was right in the fire line and was probably on fire by the time I had that thought. So I was mostly worried about my property in Phoenix and Talent burning up, and rightly so. The fire did find its way to my house via blackberry growing along the irrigation ditch behind it. I kind of figured this project was toasted because of the fury of the fire. And when I drove up onto Highway 99 and came into Talent, just looking at all the destroyed buildings and everything, I thought, man, that's just too bad. And then I turned the corner and I saw this project area, and I just went, oh my goodness, it hardly looked like it had been touched. I mean, it was singed, even though 100% of the project saw fire, and the neighborhood above it was vaporized and the neighborhood below it was vaporized. So I started looking at this like, well, what is it about this project that made it different? You know, why did it fare differently than so many of the other riparian areas in the Alameda? Number one, it didn't have any blackberry growing in it. Number two, it was dominated by native plants. And even though a lot of those were shrubs at ground level, we plant them so densely that as they begin to mature, they shade out and exclude a lot of the growth on the ground. So we had woody species and very little growth on the ground of blackberry or other fuels. So the fire actually, when it hit this riparian area, it dropped down and it just crawled along the ground, singeing the understory. It burned around the few bases of a few older trees and where there was some detritus. But generally, this fire was restorative for this riparian area, whereas so much of the rest of the Alameda fire area, the burn was catastrophic and removed everything. So because this site didn't burn hot, the trees retained their leaves, and after the burn, they began to drop them. That leaf drop is covering the soil and protecting it from erosion as the rains come this fall. Seeds from ash and things like that are already falling in alder onto these sites that will resprout. So in general, the fire actually was restorative for this plant community. And so it really got me thinking that, you know, some of the things I talked about earlier about community safety, you know, we're now seeing that the same practices that equate to a good quality riparian restoration project also make these projects and these restored plant communities resilient to fire. Our native plants are fire adapted. So when they're not mixed in with a bunch of highly flammable invasive plants like blackberry, they actually don't burn at the same kind of fury and intensity that we saw for so much of the Greenway where blackberry dominated it. And this is also true for the Lone Pine project. The fire in Central Point creeped its way up towards that project, but we had previously through Blue Sky given Lomakatsi a grant to do a restoration at the mouth of Lone Pine Creek. When the fire hit that restoration area where the weeds had been managed, it dropped down and they were able to contain it. And so it didn't wick its way further up into Lone Pine Creek. So restoration can actually act as a fire break in these areas too. And hopefully in the future, as we begin to work down the Greenway and recovering it, we will begin to see some real benefits in terms of community safety come out of that work, as well as the water quality stuff that we're after. So this is a picture of a site down in Ashland. This is where that fire, where the Alameda fire started, right next to here. This was a native willow community, although it was mixed in heavily with blackberry. You can see it burned hot. The blackberries are going to come back, and so are the willows. The question will be, do we let the willows get ahead and take control of the site through some stewardship, or will we let it return to a lower functioning condition than what it was previous to the fire? Hopefully we're going to get in there and turn this into something really great. And we want to see that happen through all of Oregon's rivers and creeks, but definitely here, we're going to work hard in the Rogue to materialize gains from these disturbing fires.
Awesome. Thank you, Eugene, Hillary, Alex, and Caitlin for sharing that knowledge and perspective on our work here in the Rogue. For those of you who I have yet to have the pleasure of meeting, my name is Haley Walker, and I'm the communications director here at the Freshwater Trust. I know on behalf of all of us, we are so excited that you all could join us this evening for this event. This is the first of our Basin focused events that we are going to have throughout the rest of this year and then into 2021 as well. We are really excited to offer this opportunity for our followers and our supporters to kind of lean a little bit further into this work and hear directly from some of our brilliant staff members who work on the ground and then also behind the scenes, just kind of achieving these really amazing outcomes. So I have the pleasure of grilling my colleagues this evening, which they probably would feel like I do on a regular evening anyways. So I'll just roll right in. Alex, this first question is for you. Can you tell me a little bit more, and all of our followers, just about how philanthropy particularly helps kind of catalyze our work in the Rogue? We've heard a lot about the partnerships and a lot about our contracts with municipalities, but we're interested in hearing a little bit more about the unrestricted dollars that come in the door.
Absolutely. Thanks, Haley. Yeah, I've been a part of a lot of the negotiations around the contracts that are bigger dollar numbers, but I would say the individual donor philanthropy and some of the grants we've gotten are smaller but very mighty for what we now have in the Rogue. For example, the Freshwater Trust couldn't have even started having discussions with City of Medford back in 2010, 2011, if it wasn't for our individual donors believing in our effort to figure out new models of bringing more resources into river restoration using new technologies, using analytics, et cetera. We did a lot of analysis for City of Medford on our own dime, which of course is individual donor funded. And that turned into, as we discussed, the first big program, $6.5 million. And that led to the success that you just heard about. I think after 2011, once we had the City of Medford contract, then Bureau of Reclamation, and then Ashland and others, that philanthropy has been just as impactful, because every time you get out on site, there's little things that don't fit into the contract, but are really big environmental opportunities. And so the philanthropy has allowed, for example, planting the opposite bank of a small stream that isn't shade generating, but is really important for fish, livestock exclusion, taking out more invasive species than just the planting area, things like that. And then in 2018, at our annual golf tournament in Bandon Dunes, which is named Fight for Fish. Hopefully some of the folks on the line have been there or can go in the future. They started a Rogue Challenge, and that has raised over $800,000 in just 2 years, which has really helped do some of those projects that just don't fit any of our contracts perfectly, but are really big environmental benefits. And then going forward, I have to mention, we like using philanthropy to, do what I just described, but we also see the opportunity now for that philanthropy, future philanthropy, to be catalytic, because the work we've put on the ground and the analyses we've done give us now a pretty good ability to figure out how much is enough. I don't know how many of you saw, but we just announced a big partnership with Microsoft. We're analyzing the entire Sacramento River, all of the irrigated lands, all the different activities. Like the power of the tools that we have now is incredible. And in terms of the Rogue, what we would like to be able to fund is how many activities, what types of actions on forested lands, on agricultural lands, stormwater runoff in urban areas, how many of what types of activities for what price tag can actually fix this river. And by fix, obviously, we're not going back to pre-human habitation in the Rogue, but every river has a tipping point. And if we can get it back on the good side of that tipping point, we know that it'll continue to improve itself. And so we now have the technology to figure out what the finish line looks like and scenarios that in terms of how much it costs. And I think that's the next step for us philanthropically, is figuring out how to find those folks that are energized by that type of philanthropy, so that we can hopefully in our lifetimes, or even sooner in our careers, figure out how to really restore function to the entire river, and obviously then go to many more rivers beyond the Rogue. But our work here gives us a lot of confidence that that type of stuff is possible.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. All right, we have one for you, Eugene, or if you'd like to pass it, that's also allowed. Eugene, is solar load quantified with a model or field data? And this comes with a follow-up question. At what point will results be able to be quantified with temperature sampling?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It comes up a lot with things related to water quality trading. So, that basically we can quantify the amount of shade or kilocalories blocked from the river. We can predict what that is based on vegetation conditions. So we use reference sites that are non-disturbed, non-project areas as a baseline for sort of what is business as usual with no action. We add what we would do differently and how that might influence the plant community. So say taking an area that's dominated by blackberry and tops out at 12 feet, we can plant a cottonwood forest there, grow it to 100 feet. we can quantify using shadolator, which is the kind of accepted model at this point, how much shade is created. But we do annual monitoring on all of our projects. So we're actually verifying at every year that we're on track to achieve those modeled outcomes. So we will be able to track that we have achieved that and adjust whatever shade benefit is derived based on our true data from the site. But actually picking up a temperature signal in a river, especially a river the size of the Rogue, from individual projects, even when there's several miles of them, is very difficult because there's a lot of other factors that influence temperature, like what temperature is coming out of a dam or what temperature is coming out of an unmanaged tributary. So there's a lot going on there, but on small tributaries, the temperature signal is picked up really quickly. So when you're doing, extensive amount of work like we did on Neal Creek, where you do over a mile and you do both sides and you're on a small stream, definitely be able to pick up a temperature signal there within just 5 or 6 years with good establishing veg. And we do some of that work with temperature loggers. We have a study on the Applegate River where we have a whole bunch of projects clustered, and we also study Neal Creek and other streams that we're working on, looking for those signals. So.
Awesome, thanks, Huge. So this one is for Caitlin and Hillary. I'll let you guys kind of tag team this one. Related to the recent wildfires, are there some areas that are better to let nature bounce back naturally? And how will we be monitoring each of these sites differently post-fire to kind of document some of the recovery processes?
I was gonna let Kate take that one because she manages a lot more of the riparian projects. Maybe I'll kick it off, Kate, and then you can take over for me. Okay, well, so we have, I think that question could be taken a couple ways. We have some projects that we hadn't planted yet, in which case we have pre-project photos that we take that this year happened to be right before the Alameda fire took off. And so that's a really good visual representation of what the project looked like. And then we went back and took repeat photos from the exact same location that document the conditions post-fire. And then we also have a monitoring procedure that looks at that vegetation and can identify what is coming back. We can also assess soil conditions and the burn severity in those locations to see whether it's likely that we'll have existing plant survival. And then when we plant the project, we have what Eugene was starting to talk about, that quantitative and qualitative annual monitoring that occurs. So there's kind of 3 tiers. There's the visual photos, qualitative assessments, and then the quantitative assessments. And that gives you your like stem density and canopy closure type of data. And on our water quality trading project, that extends for 20 years. So we get a good analytical look at what that project looked like as it recovers from fire. I think I got like a part of that question. Maybe Eugene, or maybe Caitlin, you can, or Eugene, you can jump in for the second half.
No, I think Hillary answered that question really well. I think it really comes down to visiting the site and seeing what all was growing on the site before. Hillary had mentioned burn severity, so just how hot had that fire burned, what kind of invasive species were there, what kind of native stock might return, and really each site is just so different. So we really try to cater to the needs of the site and the species that we see there and wanting to return.
Awesome, thanks guys. Alex, my next question is for you from the audience. Have you calculated what the economic benefit is of each additional salmon that spawns in the Rogue watershed?
I saw that. That is an interesting one. We have not done it by salmon spawning. So I would be really interested to learn more. I saw that there was a link there too. We have done a lot of economic analysis that's more about the overall impact of dollars spent on restoration. There was a great University of Oregon study probably a decade ago now by Dr. Mosley and Matt and Dr. Nielsen Pincus that we definitely have used to understand better. I think there's roughly 20 local jobs for every $1 million spent. And we've seen at least that in terms of the effect of all that money spent on contractors and other partners that it takes to get this work done. So we've definitely looked at the value of the dollar bouncing around. It's certainly much better than the value of a dollar spent on a cooling tower or some other type of gray infrastructure. And certainly especially during a pandemic, it's nice to be able to offer jobs that are outdoors and pretty low transmission risk. But definitely we'll look at how to even evolve that per fish. Or the restoration economy is another one that we've seen. And certainly the more that this program grows, it would be great to get more resources pointed at building kind of those economic success stories as well.
Great. Eugene, I know a lot of folks are super interested in how our landowner relationships get made. This is a pretty unique part of the Freshwater Trust where we are not your traditional conservation organization. We really do partner with real landowners out in rural places. So can you tell me a little bit about what it takes to kind of build the trust with these folks who are critical to actually achieving the outcomes that we've talked about during this entire presentation?
Sure, and you're right. That's such a crucial part of what we do. When I came to the Freshwater Trust and went about trying to implement water quality trading projects, one of the big hurdles that people envisioned and I saw early on was that we were asking landowners to sign up for 20 years to allow us to re-enter their properties and manage these riparian areas. That's a lot of trust. I mean, that's a long time to bring somebody into your private property unless you really feel good about what they're going to do and about them probably as a person. So a lot of it really had to do, relationship building, which means revisiting people time and time again, developing understanding of their objectives for their land and how our work might integrate into that, as well as to benefit them and help them move towards their objectives. So at the end of the day, it's about building trust, and it's about actions that are complementary to each other and figuring out ways to, really make it make sense for these landowners when they see real gains and benefits for their property, so that they're not just doing it out of goodwill, but they actually see real material benefit that comes from the project, as well as the ecological benefits that we're after when we do that. So developing those relationships, it's like, for these projects, some of them are 8 years old now. I have good friends that I've made across the landscape. I think that we all have as project managers connected deeply to these people that we work with, learning about their life, learning about their history and how they manage their piece of the road. We're just really happy to be part of it and to be able to assist them in doing good things on their property that also benefit us as whole in the society. So.
Awesome. All right, this one comes from the audience. As I understand it, rain or water abundant streams are not a problem in Southern Oregon. Does any of the Rogue have problems with rain for water that new trees need for riparian growth?
Well,
or is that a problem that TFT has faced? Go ahead, Huge.
Yeah, I'll take that one. No, we're drought stressed in the Rogue. The Rogue's in the midst of a drought, and it's been through many drought cycles, probably drier than most of the basins in Oregon, even though it's headwatered, so high in the Cascades at Crater Lake. So, you just have a lot of demands for water. The Rogue River irrigates a lot of acres in the Rogue Valley, some of Oregon's most productive farmlands. And although we have storage in the system, storage comes at a price. It means altering the hydrology of our waterways in order to fill that storage and release it at the times when it's most valuable to people and farming and that kind of thing. So water is really limited, and the way we've dealt with it is to develop highly efficient supplemental irrigation strategies to help establish our projects. So we use drip systems, and we do them, we manage them very closely to mimic natural conditions that help native plants establish. We use things, some traditional or non-traditional materials like plastic mulch that people often say, oh, plastic, what's that doing out here? Well, it actually is really effective at holding soil moisture and helping plants establish and keeping weeds back from them without the use of chemicals. So we make some, trade-offs like that. We sort of utilize some of the tactics that traditional agriculture and innovative agriculture is using we harness those techniques to establish native plant communities here in the Rogue. Efficiency is the key, and then working with landowners to, either utilize existing irrigation rights or lease and transfer irrigation to the places it's needed. So those are some of the things we do.
Awesome. Either for Huge or Hillary, regarding the Neal Creek project, how many property owners were involved in that, and did they initiate it or did TFT, and what has been the timeline of that work?
I can tackle that one too, because I helped make that original connection. And now it was, a case of, I've been driving by that stretch of Neal Creek. It's one single ownership. The historic Dunn Ranch was one of the first land claims in this part of Oregon. So really one of the first developed properties in the Rogue Valley, around 400 acres with almost a mile of the stream on one single ownership. So I approached those owners and proposed that we do a salmon restoration project that would improve the ranch as well as to improve the habitat. And they didn't believe me. They didn't believe there were salmon in that stream because you couldn't even see the stream through the blackberries. But we cleared it, we built it, we put wood in there. The owner came down with his wife, and the first pool we walked up to, there were 2 Chinook spawning there, and it just blew their minds. And, after that, it was like game on to do more of that work with them. They would love, keep going, do more.
Yeah, and we highlighted one, large riparian restoration project on Neal Creek in this presentation, but we also installed a large wood project with Bureau Reclamation this summer on Neal Creek that involved 3 landowners, and we have 2 fish passage projects coming up next summer on Neal Creek that will open up more of Neal Creek to juvenile fish migration than is currently available. So that's 7 landowners right there in those several projects.
I'd also put in a plug for the analytics that we all use. Doing advanced analysis on these rivers and tributaries means that we know every property and we know how many environmental benefits, shade, et cetera, could be generated on those properties. And that means that by and large, although there's a couple of, places where it didn't work exactly like this, but by and large, we are initiating conversations and we already have funding in hand and a plan for a private property before they even hear from us. And that's a big difference. There's a lot of money spent on conservation in this country, both federal, state, all over the place. But I would say the dominant way that it hits the ground is with landowners raising their hand. And that can work well in some situations, but we've also seen how that can mean that the money just doesn't have much environmental impact, because the landowners that are most interested in getting conservation work on their land or getting incentivized to do different things are generally not the ones that are having the biggest impact. And so since we all have limited amounts of funds, we really push for analyzing, quantifying environmental benefits, and having that really lead the way on where we go with our projects.
Awesome. I think we have time for maybe one more. Hill, I'm going to pitch this one to you. When you go out to a project site and you're monitoring, I know you don't have props with you, which maybe you do, I don't know. Bring them into this picture. Tell us a little bit about what you're looking for when you're going out and what kind of determines the health of a project site.
Okay, that's a fun question. I'm sorry, Haley. I do not have props with me to do a cameo for you, but I mean, I'd say that we rely heavily on procedures. Like, we're a science-based organization, and so we have even our qualitative assessments. while they're qualitative in nature, we still have a procedure that we follow so that we're looking at the same characteristics time and time again. And so, the photo point, the qualitative, the quantitative, not only do we follow those procedures every time that are built to help objectively assess a project, but the Freshwater Trust has developed a custom web-based application that we use to collect data in the field that also is kind of like a built-in QA/QC on how we evaluate a site. So we try to take the objectivity out of it, as much as possible. But there's an art to all of this as well. There's a fluidity to those landowner relationships, to intuition and how you visit a project. But overall, we're very process-based, and that's why we rely so heavily on the tools and the science and the analytics that Alex is talking so much about. Did that answer?
I think that answered it. Yeah, and you guys can see a lot more of Hillary out in the field and Caitlin and Eugene on some of our social media channels. I think given that we only have 2 minutes left, we're gonna have to wrap it up a little bit. So I know many of you had questions that were not answered, but we're really invested as a team here to answer those questions. And we really want to make sure to develop relationships with each of you. So if you had a question, or if one comes up as you're cooking dinner later, feel free to send it to Caroline Brown. Her email is here at caroline@thefreshwatertrust.org, and we're going to pitch it over to the proper staff who can answer it for you. Additionally, like I said, I really encourage you all to follow along with our work on social media. Another really great thing to stay in tune with is our Uplift report, which is dropping on Monday. Many of you receive that every year. It is kind of what we call our annual report, but really that quantified outcome piece that you guys have heard Eugene and Caitlin and Alex and Hillary speak about this entire time. It's the most succinct infographics that we have on the results of our work. So if for some reason you didn't get it and you'd like a copy, feel free to also email Caroline about that, and we'll make sure to get one of those over to you. Again, on behalf of the entire team of the Freshwater Trust, we're so excited that this many folks came out to listen to our work about the Rogue, and definitely stay tuned for our next event, which is going to be about some of the fish response that we've had in the Sandy River Basin, which is of course really close to Portland. So again, hope you guys have a really great evening, and we'll see you soon.